Um, I am absolutely delighted that Casey Dunning has agreed to moderate this panel. Casey has been a wonderful friend to the USAID Alumni Association for the last couple of years. You know, we've had this great site for our meetings, and Casey has been Nancy Birdsall's main link to us over this period, and she's been of enormous help. And she now has this wonderful title of the first CGD, what is this? What is it? What is the title? Is your oh, I see.
A policy
What
fellow.
is the title?
A CGD policy fellow. It's
A CGD
something new we're trying.
Policy fellow at AID. So she bridges CGD, the source of all inspiration, and AID, the source of all implementation of inspired ideas. And but Casey has done lots of work on a variety of issues while she's been here, and she was also very much involved in the formulation of some of the ideas that lie behind the SDGs, so that the future of the world has been really in her hands. And,
no pressure.
And now she's going to have a chance to look back on history as she leads this panel, and she will introduce the panel. But we have until, when, I think quarter of one. We have 75 minutes or 70 minutes now before lunch, and we hope to have presentations of about 15 minutes each, and then interaction with all of you. So, Casey, the floor is yours, and thank you so much for doing this.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for inviting me. I was telling Tish, every year the agenda gets better and better, and I'm so honored to be a part of this meeting and the work that you do all throughout the year. I am also especially pleased to be moderating this the second panel. Hopefully we will keep on with the excellent discussion from the first and just keep raising the bar. I will quickly introduce the panelists. You have all their bios in the handout. And I'd also quickly note that both Jim and Larry have one-page handouts on the topics of their discussion. And so especially for Larry's remarks, if you could take a quick glance at his blurb, he has requested that you do that as a primer. So we'll start with Michael Pillsbury, who is a senior fellow and director of the Center on Chinese Strategy at the Hudson Institute. Incidentally, he has also just produced this new book, The 100-Year Marathon, a #1 national bestseller. So have a look. It's on Amazon.
Is it available in the corridors out here?
It is not, but I'm told Amazon.com is your #1 place for it. So definitely go take a look. And then we'll be followed by Jim Fox, who, as I was noting from his bio, it would be easier to name the U.S. agencies that he has not worked at and been a part of. And so we'll hear from him on Costa Rica. And then finally, Larry Heilman, who is a research associate in the anthropology department at Smithsonian's Natural History Museum. So with that, we'll turn to Michael.
Thank you. The origins of this project to produce what is still an unpublished kind of underground classic, which history of USAID, some case studies, is rather obscure. Jim Fox had something to do with it. So did another economist named Alan Batchelder. And their thinking at the time was, let's find a kind of outsider who has worked on the Senate staff on USAID budget, but is basically an outsider. And let's commission him or her to do a kind of history of the rise and fall of economic policy reform. And I've forgotten how they actually found me. But I was intrigued, and I went, because of my own training and government work in the national security part of our government, my first thought was, well, let's go into the classified archives of USAID, and can I please meet the historian of USAID? Because even CIA has a large historical staff. There's a government law that requires all agencies to have historical staffs. So a common sense, almost the very first question was, where is the office and phone number of the historian for USAID. And there was all these pained looks like, well, and finally I found a general counsel attorney who said, no, we've exempted ourselves from that law. So then the question arose, well, where are the archives? And I don't know if you remember, Jim, but Batchelder would drive out to Suitland and another place called Newington, I think it is. And sure enough, somebody, for some reason, had packaged all of the classified message traffic, internal memos, things that were classified and unclassified, put them in huge cardboard boxes, unsorted. That was the history of USAID as I found it at that point. Now, there were academic studies. There were certainly hundreds of what are called evaluations. And at some point, very early, AID had committed. We are going to evaluate our projects. And there were a few things called higher above projects were programs. So there were some evaluations of those. They were helpful, but they were not a history. So failing that, we did two things. Go interview people who were involved, if he or she were still alive, and plenty were, number one. Number two, go to the presidential libraries where classified documents are stored. There are archivists employed by the federal government to handle this material. I was quite familiar with this process already. So I said, we're going to start with Taiwan and then Korea, because these were well-known success stories. And the first thing we found was feet and feet and feet of organized material on how USAID and its predecessor had functioned in Taiwan. The success story, the details, the people, and quite surprisingly, the role of the President of the United States, two presidents, first Eisenhower and then Kennedy. NSC staff meetings where the USAID director attended, CIA reports on how to better perform economic policy reform in that country, and a document which had to search and search and search for called the 19 Points. It was how to interfere in Taiwan's economic policy-making process to bring about what today would be called free market reforms. Taiwan in those days was about as socialist as you can get. There's no Federal Reserve, all prices were set. There was no foreign investment. It's hard to imagine if you visited Taiwan today. By the way, everything I'm saying now about Taiwan goes double for South Korea. No foreign investment, almost no exports, no Federal Reserve Central Bank, no consciousness of economic policy might be a ticket to growth. And the classified records showed that for national security reasons, President Kennedy in particular wanted South Korea and Taiwan to be success stories. So unlike what you could imagine the polar opposite of country X, where country X, yes, is highly socialist in its structure and policies, but USAID would have no leverage and the president and the White House would have no interest. This would be the polar opposite case to think about. So going through the materials, and I brought some of them here partly for nostalgic regions. When you make copies of classified documents, you have to be careful. You can go to jail. And several people I know personally have gone to jail. But the presidential libraries have thought this through, so they use a different color paper for when you're classifying documents. So in my hand, this is about 3 inches of stuff on how in South Korea, USAID reversed the entire economic policy framework and the nature of South Korean economic policies, from a kind of total autarky to the South Korea we know and love today. Now, what was interesting, you go to the library and check out books on South Korea economic miracle or Asia economic miracle. Alex is here. World Bank allegedly spent $1 million to do its East Asia economic miracle, very color glossy, beautiful brochure with all kinds of footnotes, in which the World Bank basically takes credit itself for the East Asia Economic Miracle. but
What else is new?
but it shares credit with all the brilliant leaders in South Korea, Taiwan, etc., as well. Then there's a little footnote saying some of these leaders seem to have received advice on economic policy from various U.S. government, missions and advisors and so forth. Well, that is as close to a lie as you can get. The documents show personal involvement of the President of the United States in the details of economic policy reform, Taiwan, Korea, and then, of course, we expanded the project to Indonesia, some delicious case studies in India, and we fast-forwarded to study 12 more examples. Somehow the techniques that were used were also used in Central America. Some of them survived in Russia. I found 13 techniques explicitly referred to in this one then classified speech by the mission director in South Korea in Seoul. In both Taiwan and Seoul, the AID mission directors, imagine this as a dream, were able to organize in total violation of the sovereignty of South Korea and Taiwan. They organized boards co-chaired by AID staff from the mission and others from the embassy, and basically vice ministers from the governments. And these boards controlled money. They controlled the grants. They controlled a large number of things involving export policy, loan rates, private sector. The boards were resisted by the governments, by the old autarky-minded people who knew the 50s. Today, the term crony capitalism is common, but in those days it was not. These boards succeeded in persuading the president of the country to change the policies. Notice what AID mission directors were doing. They were dealing with the president back in Washington. I found several NSC staff meetings with President Johnson in attendance, Dean Rusk, director of CIA, director of USAID, discussing the details of why isn't this country meeting the requirements laid out last year when we had the NSC meeting on economic policy reform. So what the documents are showing at several phases, A, the lead of the mission director, and back to this guy in South Korea, he was a very important labor activist to come out of the AFL-CIO, had some experience in the Marshall Plan, and in some sense took no prisoners with the South Korean government. Now he was soon to inherit a new dictator, part of whose program was, when I get in power, which meant tomorrow, first we're going to kill all the economists. The mission director, President Kennedy and later Johnson, converted this whole sort of military dictatorship team to being, I hate to pick a university, but let's pick Yale, being Yale class PhD economics experts. It's nothing short of a miracle in both these cases. It's then tried again, it meaning this pattern. One of the 13 points is to find allies in the host government. And if you can't do that, in the case of Costa Rica, as Jim probably is going to point out, find the political opposition and get them ready for smart economic policy reform in that country and wait it out until they get in. And in some very dramatic cases, that has happened with USAID intervention. So when I went to interview the individuals, at first, as AID culture is, they would deny everything. Oh, no, I can't, what? And I would say, no, look at this. Perhaps this will refresh your memory. And eyebrows went up. Whoa. One of my favorites, and I eventually did a talk, which I think is online at CSIS, called The Seven Samurai of USAID Economic Policy Reform. And I gave the talk without looking around and seeing one of the samurai was in the audience. Is she here today? Janet Valentine. Aha! She was one of the deniers. And I said, no, you flew into Managua, Nicaragua before the election and you set up a transition team for economic policy reform, and I have the cable. And I think Janet said something like, but that's classified. And Janet appears again as a heroine, in Moscow. And that's just the beginning of it. But with AID's culture, see, I'm used to the Pentagon, CIA, where everybody wants a medal. I'm in a campaign. I spent 3 days in theater. I want my Iraqi campaign medal. And I was there. A culture that I'm used to takes credit. CIA, not publicly, but still inside CIA. There are medals, there are award ceremonies. The ultimate, of course, is to have your star up on the wall that you were killed. But USAID is not that way. So with the help of the interviews and the documents, I tried to assemble as an outsider. This is apparently what happened. And I fast forwarded the whole thing to Moscow, 1992, I think it was. The vouchers, the whole story. I had to remove Harvard from some of the earlier case studies. But that is the essence of what is in this manuscript. And then became the issue, well, let's publish this. I think Jim Fox was enthusiastic.
Right.
Jim would go to American Economics Association conferences and say, there's an unpublished study by Michael Pillsbury called Secret Successes of USAID, and everybody should read this. Why wasn't it published? Well, we get back to USAID culture. I still remember very vividly, and the person may be in the room also, the case against publication, which came close to saying USAID is like CIA. We should not be taking credit for things host governments did. And I would say, even if the World Bank is doing it, and no, just because of your one time there. So the answer would basically be, well, what's the World Bank doing? And then I would show this document. And at one point, we got almost all the way to publication, and then there was a comment from a security review officer. Same thing I ran into with this book. Security review is now done by many agencies. You can't just go, this book, I couldn't just go to DOD, say, please clear this. They then farm it out to CIA, NSA, and one agency didn't want its name mentioned in my thank you. And they remove good stuff. So what have I been hinting at is in these documents? CIA material, State Department material, other government agencies material. Because in the good old days of economic policy reform, this was a presidential matter. Meetings were held with the president. The last time I could find this actually happening in records is 1983-84 with Ronald Reagan. Reagan gets involved in Mubarak's reform plan and this beautiful case study. I went to Cairo, interviewed the players. This beautiful case study, where to use my vocabulary, sorry for sounding like a mafia person, but USAID invented a way to bribe the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Agriculture into policy reform for the agricultural loan bank and system to free up, to have free prices for agriculture. And the payment system that I'm referring to was brilliant. In addition to all the side payments to help the economy and help agriculture, there were specific payments to the Ministry of Agriculture. If you succeed in doing this and this and this, you will have funds transferred not to your personal account, but to the ministry's account. So capacity building for pay, as it were, was invented and added to in this project. Some of the people I interviewed said they had learned this from where? Korea and Taiwan. So there seemed to me to be a case that USAID is a learning organization, in part through campfire stories where Janet would say something, and younger officers would hear this. Or she might give them a document, or they might come and visit her in Managua and say, my God, you can prepare a government before it takes over with its economic policy. But my hunch is publication of this kind of study and many others, including John's more sort of broad-based 200-year look at it, seems to me it would help with what? Something we do in DoD and CIA a lot. Training the next generation. Telling them the story that this is the organization you've joined. The Army, War College, the Marines do this to the point where half of the career, this can be fact-checked, by the way, half of the career of a military officer is spent in training or educational assignments. Almost always practical about his service. Intelligence community, very similar. There's a CIA university. There's a training for if you recruit a spy successfully, how did you do it? If the spy turned out to be a double agent, what's the lesson of that? Now, this is not evaluation of projects. This isn't saying we went into Gambia, we increased their peanut productivity, we got them to do more downstream things. This cost $1.2 million. It was a success, signed a USAID contractor. This is the history of the agency itself, and it's what I call successes. Now you see why I called it secret successes, because the documents were secret. I called it successes because AID people themselves were proud of what happened in the country. I also have a section that some readers don't like. Give you a couple sentences on it. I called it the rise and fall of economic policy reform at USAID. There's a movement in Congress I spend a whole chapter on. Now it's called by a different name, but in those days it was called basic human needs. It was a frontal attack on the economists and the economic reform and the approach of Kennedy and Johnson by Congress, particularly a congressman from Minnesota. Basic human needs, for a variety of intellectual history reasons, were seen as the enemy of economists. Economists were evil. They hurt poor people. They tell lies about economic growth. But we in the basic human needs community, some of us have run Nobel Prizes, by the way, we know this is a lie. We know we must directly aid poor people. And even better, if Congress earmarks accounts to force USAID to structure itself according to these earmarks. Now, there's a case that could be, obviously these people won, and what could have been done is the economists and policy reform teams, the Janet Ballantines, if you will, could have said, that's all fine. We actually do want to help poor people. We don't mind earmarks. But how about an earmark for economic policy reform? How about a unit inside USAID headed by the chief economist or someone that would do all this? That didn't happen for various reasons. The sponsors of basic human needs legislation didn't believe in it, was one of the main reasons. So two more things happened.
I'm going to have to stop you there.
I'll just say the words. World Bank.
We can open it up again for questions. I just want to make sure. All right.
Two more things happened which
30
time prevents
seconds.
me from sharing with you.
30 seconds. I don't want to provoke the ire of the audience.
Nixon and Kissinger, good liberals should all boo, Nixon, Kissinger, oh my God, warmongers, bad. Nixon and Kissinger also shifted USAID. They decided that the basic human needs votes needed to be kept, and pressure for economic policy reform is better done in a multilateral way. The World Bank, IMF, regional banks. They found the Bank of America president to chair a commission to conclude this, and they began to make changes in USAID, just as the Vietnam part of the agency's history was coming down. Economic policy reform was, in some sense, by order of President Nixon, shifted to the World Bank and IMF. That was the first really major change. The second major change that happened, time prevents me from going into it.
We're only hurting, yeah.
Okay, that's it. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, you can ask it. Jim, over to you.
Okay. My topic is the 50 years of USAID in Costa Rica. I want to start off with a historical quote from the governor of Costa Rica in 1719 when he wrote the King of Spain, "This province is the poorest and most miserable in all America. Its inhabitants grow more backward every day. The currency is the cacao bean, and silver coins are unknown. It has been impossible to discover from where derives the name of Rich Coast," which is what Costa Rica means, "since it is so enormously poor." And he went on to say, "Each inhabitant has to plant and raise that which he spends and consumes in his home every year. And this is also done by the governor, since otherwise he would perish." And that continued to be the case in Costa Rica until after World War II. Basically there is no all-weather road to go to either coast or to Nicaragua or Panama. It was basically isolated in what's called the Meseta Central, the Central Valley, where most of the people lived. And the economy lived off coffee and the Atlantic coast area off bananas. They had railroads that went to the two coasts, but it was only when the U.S. Government built the Pan American Highway that Costa Rica really was connected to its neighbors. And that was one of the great achievements of the U.S. government assistance to Costa Rica. Now, the Costa Ricans don't maintain their roads, so that the Pan American Highway got rebuilt several times over the years as it crumbled because of poor maintenance. It was still being rebuilt when I was there in the early 1970s. Anyway, let me talk about what we did there. There were really 4 phases of U.S. assistance to Costa Rica. The first phase, prior to 1972, it was just another one of the Central American countries, and we wanted to help Central America in general. It was a poor region, close to the U.S. The second phase, between 1972 and 1980, it was what I call the residual claimant for Central American assistance. Costa Rica could implement programs that other countries couldn't, and so when there was money toward the end of the fiscal year, it tended to go to Costa Rica, and Costa Rica therefore got a larger share of Central American money than anybody else, simply because they could carry out the programs. Then came the 1980s, what I call the Sandinista windfall. The Kissinger program for Central America that dumped billions of dollars into the region helped Costa Rica enormously. Costa Rica had defaulted on its foreign debt in 1982. It owed about $4 billion, which in those days was a lot of money. And it couldn't pay. I mean, what happened between the 1978 and 1982 was that the interest rate that Costa Rica was paying on its debt went from, in real terms, 0, because inflation was as high as LIBOR was in those days, and commodity prices were rising as well, so the ability of Costa Rica to pay was substantial. But then with the decline in commodity prices, the rise in interest rates, the real interest rate being paid by Costa Rica went from 0 to, by my calculation, 19%. And so it went from being able to serve its debt to the impossibility of serving its debt. So at this point, the US government rode to the rescue and provided hundreds of millions of dollars a year to help Costa Rica build its way out of the problem, along with economic reforms that opened up the economy, that simplified the business of exporting, that promoted foreign investment, and that generally made it a candidate that was doing export-led growth. Now, by the late 80s, USAID was trying to reduce aid to Costa Rica because it seemed to be progressing satisfactorily. But then the Congress stepped in and prevented us from cutting aid to Costa Rica because the President Oscar Arias had this peace plan for Central America, and the Congress thought we were punishing Costa Rica for this peace plan. So aid continued to flow at a fairly high level until 1995 when the program was closed out. Altogether, $2 billion was spent in Costa Rica, making it, on a per capita basis, the 5th highest recipient of foreign aid in the world. Well, what are the conclusions that I came to? First, let me mention methodology. It was a joint effort. 2 Costa Rican economists and I worked together to lead this. We hired 10 other Costa Rican sector experts to look at each of the 10 sectors where USAID had worked, and they reviewed thousands of documents. We interviewed hundreds of people and tried to make sense out of the perhaps 1,000 activities that were undertaken during the 50 years of aid in Costa Rica. And for me, the most interesting thing was a study of 2 villages that Michigan State in 1950 had done an extensive economic, social, political review of these 2 villages. So we sent anthropologists back to the 2 villages in 1995 to record what had happened in the 45 years since. And the answer is everything. In 1950, infant mortality was over 100. By 1995, it was in 13 or something of that sort. In 1950, the village priest was the most important person in the village. Protestants and people living together without marriage were ostracized in the community. By 1995, that had changed. The priest was no longer that important, and there were lots of Protestants. Women in 1950 usually needed permission to leave the house. It was a male-dominated society. In 1995, there were women in political leadership positions both villages had women's soccer teams, something that in 1950 would have been inconceivable. And there was a much more tolerant environment in general in 1992. In 1950, 5% of the people in the two villages had radios. In 1995, 80-some% had color TVs. 1950, a quarter of the houses had dirt floors. In 1995, nobody had dirt floors. They lived in real houses as opposed to the ranchos, or one or two room huts that were predominant in 1950. Most houses didn't have books. Pictures on the wall were often just photos out of newspapers. In 1950, or in the 50s, the teachers in one of the villages, they would stay there Monday through Friday because there was no road you had to walk out 4 or 5 miles to get to a road for a bus. And so the teachers would stay in the village, and they were the community leaders. They were the ones who promoted economic development. When USAID came to the villages during the 1950s, they promoted agricultural technology improvements. In particular, coffee productivity quadrupled between 1950 and 1995. U.S. set up 4S clubs, which is the equivalent of 4-H clubs in Spanish-speaking countries, and promoted better agriculture, and that really was the driving force behind the dramatic increase in economic well-being in those villages. By 1995, there were also some people from the villages who were working in factories in Turrialba that were exporting baseballs to the U.S. That was one result of the policy reform efforts during the 1980s, getting export-led growth to happen. In any event, let me briefly summarize our findings. The programs were collaborative and well-intentioned, and most achieved their intended purpose. Costa Rican economic and social progress was faster as a result of those efforts. Second, for the most part, USAID was pushing in the right direction. The policies and the orientations that were pursued were generally better than those existing at the time. The most evidently successful activities included the Pan American Highway, which provided the backbone of Costa Rican transportation, collaborative rural health programs, which produced spectacular success. Infant mortality falling from over 100 to almost developed country rates. And the approach to rural health was, Costa Rica was a leader. This was led to programs that were used in other countries. And the macroeconomic reform of the 1980s. In retrospect, there were two serious mistakes. The first was encouraging Costa Rica to participate in the Central American Common Market, which led to import substitution with high external tariffs and led to a lot of inefficient industrialization. When trade was liberalized in the 1980s, most of those inefficient industries couldn't compete. It was really more new firms that came in because of the more favorable economic environment that were doing the exporting. And the second was trying to enlarge government social programs in the 1970s, the basic human needs program, when in fact an economic crisis was looming, and we totally ignored what was going on in the macro area. In general, USAID approaches became better over time. Lessons from past failures in Costa Rica and elsewhere were gradually incorporated into new projects. All in all, U.S. economic assistance to Costa Rica met both the developmental and foreign policy goals it was intended to serve. Let me talk a little bit more about Costa Rica today.
You have 1 minute.
Okay. Costa Rica is still growing, but I think has failed to implement some of the needed changes, particularly in electricity and telecommunications that were needed to really bring the country into the modern era. In communications, government monopolies have persisted. Also in education, for some reason, Costa Ricans seem not to be that interested in education. There is still a lack of interest in people going to high school, and the education system doesn't seem to be satisfactory. And finally, as the economist pointed out, the current Costa Rican president is the least popular president in Latin America, at 10%, lower than Maduro in Venezuela, because of some idiocy in the last election cycle. And so it's not, the country has progressed enormously, but it's still not where it might have been had they been more forward-looking and progressive.
Thank you, John.
Could the person put my, yeah, okay. Okay, good. I want to apologize for the brightness of the yellow. At about 12 o'clock last night, playing with my computer, I couldn't figure out how to change the background. So I gave up, because I figured if I spent much more time on it, I might not get here this morning. So you just have to live with the yellow. Okay, what you see in front of you are 3 quotes. And each of these quotes, which I decided to put at the front end of my manuscript about 5 years ago, I kept my eye on these quotes because they helped me keep my eye on what I was trying to do. I was delighted to hear that you had so much help doing your piece in Costa Rica, which is excellent. And it explained to me why I've been so damn tired the last 10 years. Because quite frankly, I did this thing all by myself. And the last 5 years, as I grew more sagacious, I became more intellectually inept. And so I advise any of you who want to do a serious piece of scholarship, which I think mine is, don't wait till you're 70 years old to start it. That was a bad idea. Much of what has been said here this morning reflects very strongly what I feel in terms of the kind of experience that can be helpful in doing a serious piece of history. With regards to Bolivia, I've been stationed on active duty with the Marine Corps during periods of crisis. I came to this agency after having spent a couple years in CIA, where in my last job, was the Bolivian desk officer. And they assigned me as the desk officer because they knew I was going to move to AID. And the head of the bureau said, look, we want you to be able to do a good job in AID, but you gotta understand the history. You've gotta understand the background. And he was absolutely right by putting me on that desk, because I really learned the history of Bolivia as seen through the eyes of an agency that one of its major abilities is to understand the history and to be able to prognosticate as they go forward. So one day I'm in CIA, the next day I'm in an orientation program to go to Bolivia. And in my first hour in that orientation program, a graying older man by the name of Mr. Dove got up and said, "Welcome to the Agency of International Development, the agency without a memory." I was shocked. Here I'm a historian, and I really believe in understanding history, having memory, and he gets up and says, "The agency without a memory." Well, I proceeded taking the orientation course, and parts of it weren't very good, and parts of it were great. A guy by the name of Tony Lanza, whose son is here today working in education, gave a marvelous speech about the role of education in AID. And so I sort of walked out of that experience thinking, well, one thing I'm going to do is I'm going to really, when I get into the field, I'm going to really understand what's been done in the past and how I can apply past knowledge to being a better development officer. I also sat down and wrote a memorandum in my first 6 weeks with AID to the assistant administrator, Jim Fowler, about my orientation experience. And quite frankly, I said it was terrible. And with the exception of a couple good lectures. And I really felt it was important to explain back into this brand new bureaucracy that was liable to chuck me out within days, that really we got to focus on certain things, particularly in our orientation programs. By the way, I had gone through a superb orientation program in CIA, and obviously I had gone through a super orientation program to become an officer in the Marine Corps, and I was constantly comparing it. I think one of the biggest problems in terms of the lessons I've learned about agency is that the inconsistency of our training capacity in AID. It goes like this, up and down, up and down. At times, there's hardly any training that's worthwhile at all. So I think it's really important to sustain an excellent training capacity. Also, what I found over the years was, as the training went up and down, the level of officers that we had went up and down. And the ramifications of not keeping and maintaining a large cadre of good development officer has resulted that we've paid a lot of, we've encountered a lot of problems that we may not have encountered had we been able to keep a steady workforce of development officers in the agency. Okay. where do I go from here? One of the problems with being the one of the problems of living. Well, but I think these are important
By the way,
lessons learned.
I yield all my time to you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. One of the important things to understand in terms of Bolivia as a case story, case history, is the fact that if you look at the where Bolivia was in 1965 and where it had to go, and where Costa Rica was and where it went, Bolivia was regarded by many development places as a mission impossible. On the other hand, the reason I think, Jim, they had you do your case study was because Costa Rica was seen as a mission accomplished. And so consequently, I think it's interesting that both of these case studies are presented. And you're going to find my results interesting if I ever get to them. Okay. After Bolivia had received more than $4.6 billion from the U.S. government to support 70 years of development efforts, why would Evo Morales abruptly expel USAID from the country in May 2013? I can do a case study of the whole program now, okay? As the handout implies and points out, I felt it was imperative to tell this story that in reality, I tell 3 stories that were interrelated. You can't tell the story of Bolivia unless you can tell the story how Aid Washington and State Department articulated policies to provide guidance to the field, in this case Bolivia, and how that guidance interacted with the mission program. Basic human needs is a good example. Secondly, to tell the story of Bolivia, and all good history are stories, but to tell the history of Bolivia, you've got to, aid in Bolivia, you've got to put it in a political context. It's got to be in the historical context of the program itself. And thirdly, you've got to tell what aid did in Bolivia and how you perceive the program and its success. But a part of that is to tell the story of the USAID mission institution. If you don't understand how a mission operates, how can you reasonably understand what they did and how they went about doing their business, okay? So already I buried myself. 3 stories, 70 years, all by myself. I want to thank right now any number of officers here who I was able to interview and provided me the sort of the gist of what was really happening in the mission. And I couldn't be more thankful to those efforts. What about the lessons learned? Okay. One lesson learned was the importance to understand what happened in the 1950s. Without having an understanding of the success of the United States overseas mission in the 50s, it's really hard to understand what happened thereafter. And what I found, much to my surprise, was that in the areas of agriculture, education, and health, enormous successes and well documented. But you had to dig deep into the bowels of the mission to find it. And this surprises most people because we don't really think of Bolivia having much of a success in the 50s. More important to that was by the 1950s, by 1954, we had a full-blown USAID mission in Bolivia, a USAM, that set the pattern and the tone and the way they did business for the next 60 years. Directives have been sent out from State Department and from USAM, or the agency, Mutual Defense Agency, explaining here's the kind of projects you want to do, Here's how you do them. Here's how you report on them. We want to encourage you to do grant projects where eventually the recipient pays for the project so that eventually it can be sustainable. Everything I learned as an aid officer in the 60s and the 70s in terms of the mechanics of the aid mission, I was able to find out at the National Archives in terms of memorandums. Okay. Also, one of the high watermark successes, and it's interesting that Jim talks about this in Costa Rica, was the highway that we started funding during World War II. And in 1955, that highway connected Santa Cruz, the lowlands, to the mountainous areas. And Paz et Censoro in 1955 said it was the most successful project that any donor had ever done. And he said, without the help of the United States, we wouldn't be where we are, okay? At the core of the success of the program in Bolivia was an event that was seismic in its impact. The 1952 revolution was certainly the point of departure for development to be undertaken by the Bolivian government. Overnight, campesinos got land. The land pattern changed from 5% owning 90% of the land to 90% of the population having land themselves, okay. 2, the campesino got the vote and partook in the democratic process. 3, the campesino schools were available to the campesino, so they could begin to learn how to reckon, how to speak Spanish, and these 3 things were absolutely foundational. Now, this was the Bolivian Revolution. It wasn't the American Revolution. This was the Bolivian Revolution. What happened thereafter? In 1955, Eisenhower decided to send his brother, Melton, down to Bolivia to see what the situation was. Melton came right back to John Foster Dulles, and then in turn goes into the White House and says, we really need to help these people. They're poor. The revolution may be sort of a socialist, communist revolution, but by God, we're not going to get in trouble because they're way down there in the left-hand corner. Let's help the little guy. And the largest aid program that we had in South America in the 50s, in the 1955 congressional presentation, was Bolivia, the largest program. Anybody want to guess what the second largest program was? Well, come on. Guatemala. Polar opposites. Polar opposite. Guatemala, where there had been a counter-revolution, and it was a program that turned their revolution back, compared with Bolivia, an entirely different sort of revolution. So what happens from 1955 on, and this is the lesson learned, we become partners. And we sustain that partnership all the way to when Evo Morales becomes president, okay? It was a partnership, and the title of my book is Partners Are Patron, okay? And Patron is in Spanish, because I want the Spanish definition. But it would have been so easy for us to be the big patron, okay? We were big patrons in other countries in Latin America, and that was one of the issues we always had. That's why I include the quotation from the Spaniard about what he was afraid would happen with the Colossus in the north that would, after we had helped them, then, they would be an outside and maybe negative influence on Latin America. We're always fighting that image in Latin America. So the lesson learned in this case is that if you're going to have development, it's got to be the host country that's in the lead. We can be a good partner, and we have been a good partner. But also, in every instance, all the way up until Morales becomes president, it is always in our national interest to have this relationship. One, because during World War II, when the road loan was conceived, we wanted Bolivia's 10, okay? And of course, they wanted to sell it to us. And so consequently, we start the transformational program because we want Bolivian 10, okay? When it comes along to 1952, we again form a partnership because we want to, because it's in the American character, we want to help the little guy, but also we think it's better to have them as a partner than to have them as an enemy, particularly in the context of a communist situation that's looming.
I'm going to have to stop you there, unfortunately, because we are
You didn't give me 3
over
minutes.
time. I know, because
Okay.
I didn't want to interrupt.
There are,
until
just
now.
one last comment, okay. The irony of what we did in Bolivia is seen in the fact that Jim's recommendations are the things he highlights in terms of successes work also for Bolivia. And my book fully spells that out. And again, it's the irony. The country that was seen as the basket case, as compared to the country that was inevitably a success story, they come up with the same sort of accomplishments and the lessons learned. There's something interesting in that little story.
I want to thank our three panelists for incredibly rich discussions. Is it okay if we go till 12:50, and is that okay? Okay. Okay. Nothing beyond. All right. So as you think of your questions, I'm going to pose one question, and you must answer in one sentence. So you've highlighted a lot of the successes of what of how USAID was able to accomplish so much in each of these countries, whether it was having the interagency buy-in and the attention at the highest levels of the White House, or having a keen focus on a particular sector like infrastructure in Costa Rica that was so needed, or having this partnership with a host government as you described in Bolivia. But I'm also wondering about kind of the challenges and constraints that you came across in your work. So in your estimation, what was the largest, and I know there are many, but the largest challenge or constraint that USAID faced in its work in each of your given contexts, whether it's agency or interagency or partner government or something else. But what was the biggest challenge? We'll start with you, Jim. And sentence, remember.
It can be a long
Yeah.
sentence. Several clauses.
Yes. Or just choose your favorite.
I'm
in
not
this
sure
moment.
what the biggest challenge was. Maybe it's that in general, Latin America tends to be very conservative and backward-looking, and trying to turn the region into a more forward-looking one, I think, is a problem.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Jim? I'm sorry. Larry, and then we'll end.
Well, one specific problem was that when we decided to support the revolution, we also supported the nationalization of the tin industry, which was owned by three gentlemen who owned 65% of the tin. That turned out to be a terrible mistake because the National Mining Corporation was always running in the red, and it really pulled the economy down. I think the second major problem would have been what Jim described, because the Aymara Quechua population was very conservative, and they were always fighting against the fact that for 500 years, the society had been held by white elitists, And when you get right down to it, the guys that ran the revolution were white elitists. So that was that very tricky problem.
And Michael?
The biggest challenge, not just for China, for Taiwan and Korea, but running through the case studies I did, the biggest challenge, looking back, was the lack of a kind of central strategy formation unit in either USAID or in the missions. So this is a long sentence, comma. So you often find gifted people as mission directors or high up in the USAID system who are able to create a strategy for a specific country, get the attention of the President of the United States, get resources, stay at least several years, and see the strategy through. But that was very rare. And it seemed to be, the reason I began using the word 7 samurai is you could pick out, and other people in the USAID knew this, you could pick out individuals, back to Janet Ballantyne again, where people knew some kind of a miracle had been pulled off, and they were hazy on how it was done, but they knew about it and they knew the person who had done it. But there was not a central strategic planning unit where young people like you, if I may, Casey, could go in, open up something that said top secret, USAID and presidential strategies that worked, and then read through. Maybe it might take you 2 days, might take you a week. But when you came out of that secret reading room, you'd be a different person in terms of USAID and strategy. I did not find that.
Wonderful. All right, I'm going to do a single round of questions, but we'll take a couple, so hopefully I'll try and write them all down, but that's the plan since we're short on time. So questions, please. We'll start on this side with this gentleman, and then we'll move across.
Hello, is this on?
Yes.
Good, okay. I'm Jonathan Sanford. I was with the Congressional Research Service for almost 40 years. Alex Shakow, I met him at a conference. He invited me to come here. So thank you for this opportunity to hear this very interesting presentation. Now, I agree with Michael Pillsbury that sometime in the late 60s, early 70s, the issue of economic policy reform was shifted over to the multilateral institutions from bilateral aid. And we saw that pattern increase. The multilateral banks did it on a sectoral project level, and in the late 80s, they turned working on a broad structural adjustment, structural adjustment, broad policy reform level. Later on, however, it was my impression that there's been a reaction back against that. Whole series of other priorities get dropped in: environment, direct assistance to the poor, direct targeted assistance to the poor, and other things as criteria. My observation is that it is very difficult to, on a policy level, for governments to sustain economic policy reform agendas in their aid program, because the basic humanitarian impulse, which I think underlies the support for foreign assistance, works to add or diffuse or broaden that. And I wonder your comment.
Let's go to this lady right here. I think you had, yes. There's
I found
a microphone.
myself feeling, oh, sorry, beg your pardon. Thank you all three for very interesting.
Identify yourself, please.
Sorry, my name is Julie Ray, and I was an education officer with USAID for 20 years. And before that, I was with the Peace Corps for 3 years in Senegal. And I would begin by saying that I joined AID with so much hesitation as a former Peace Corps volunteer.
By the way, my first job was in the Peace Corps.
Yeah.
In headquarters.
And I think you explained why.
65.
I think I'm so proud of the Janet Ballantynes. I'm just so proud of what they have done. But I also experienced the stigma against our government when I was a Peace Corps volunteer. And I lived that in AID when I went back and tried to work with Peace Corps on education, and they would not tolerate the publication of any lessons learned from the countries where we successfully work together, but in an informal way. We wanted to spread lessons learned. Peace Corps would hear nothing of it because of our stigma. So what you said filled me with pride, but also gave me the creepy crawlies. And look at what happens
For good reason.
when we articulate the Janet Ballantyne and others' success. Putin kicks us out. And so, what do we do?
Okay, I think we had, yes, if we can just pass the microphone to this lady right here.
Good question.
Thank you. I'm Colette Cowie. Mr. Pillsbury, I was struck by the way you, well, I should say, as an economist and program officer at USAID, I was struck by your contrasting economics and basic human needs. What do you think of the experience of the African Economic Reform Program that was active from, I believe, 1985 to 1990, and that I think many of us were so privileged to be able to work in?
And then I think we had one, well, I know we have more. Let's go with this gentleman right here.
Thanks. I'm Fred Scheck. I guess I was around aid for about 37 years. My observation and question is when the question was what has impacted, in your estimation, on what you were doing, I would have answered the U.S. Congress. I view Congress as, for most of my career, as the enemy. Starting with basic human needs, well-intentioned, but changed everything, and that's going on. And most recently, of course, we all had to live with earmarks, and all the interventions of the Congress. I remember in 2004, PPC racked up after the foreign aid bill was passed how to allocate the money, and first they had to take care of all the earmarks. At the end of that process, there was only $200 million left over for the rest of the world, for the whole world. And so I would say the Congress has exerted tremendous influence, mainly in a negative sense, on what we do.
Thanks, that's a great question. I know there are more, but I'm going to have to stop there. But I'm sure our panelists can speak with you after. So we have 4 questions here on the role of Congress and the massively reduced amounts of flexible funding. Your thoughts on the African economic reform agenda, the thoughts on the lack of USAID's ability to tell its story and lessons learned, and specifically as related to kind of geopolitical consequences of AID's activities, and then the sustainability of having economic policy units and agendas.
Well, the stigma.
Yes,
The stigma
the
of the
stigma,
U.S. government.
Yes. So I'll ask you to respond to the questions which compel you the most, and also these will also be your concluding remarks. And we're in negative time right now. So,
And I yielded all my time to Larry.
yeah. So sorry. So let's start with Larry, and we'll work our way back.
Yeah, with regards to the stigma problem, I think one of the most successful programs we had in Bolivia, and it resulted in the fair, free election of Evo Morales, were the programs in the democracy sector. I fought tooth and nail against the team that put those programs together in Bolivia because I said they were too audacious and it would result in a wasteful amount of money, and I felt that the administrator of the Bureau at that time was just trying to cast too wide of a net, Mr. Michael. I was wrong. The programs have had very high success, and the truth of it is those programs stretch back to the community development program. So I think we haven't overcome the stigma, but in the face of enormous skepticism, the democracy program has worked in Bolivia.
Okay, let me mention the Africa Economic Reform Program, which is one case where Congress bought the program. Congress isn't always the enemy. Sometimes they can be convinced, and the Africa Economic Reform Program was exactly one of those cases. Larry Sayers was able to convince Congress that policy reform was important, and that I believe was a very successful effort.
That's your final summation too?
Yes, yes, it is. It's his final summation.
So are you yielding time back to me?
No, there's no time to be yielded. The time.
All these questions. all
I
these
do have one
questions
more.
are
Buy
the
my
same
book.
question.
It's out.
All these questions are the same question. If you look at, and my answer is, if you look at other agencies, whether it's the Marine Corps, the CIA, the one I'm most familiar with, the Pentagon, you can get lessons. Lessons learned for USAID's future are not just from USAID people and experience. For example, the Congress is the enemy. The way the Marine Corps handled this, and the Navy too, when I first became a Senate staffer in '78, the Navy and the Marines picked their most charming, most brilliant, some would say most handsome officers,
Never
and
qualified.
they assigned them up inside the Senate office building. So I've been on duty only 2 weeks when I got a call from Captain John McCain. Could I come by for a beer at 5:30? I was on the Senate Budget Committee for Defense and National Security and USAID. When I came down, I met the major who was his deputy. His name is Jim Jones. Jim Jones became a hero and the commandant of the Marine Corps. The military deliberately selects people who know about strategy, have specific experiences, and are good communicators and impressive models to be their front line to work with who? Everybody in Congress? No, they target. They write classified memos. Who has influence? Who can earmark USAID? Who cares about USAID? Let's get the names, their background, what they studied, what countries they want to travel to, and let's target them and work on them. The Marine Corps several times has been asked to be eliminated by the Department of the Navy or OSD. There's no need for a Marine Corps. I've heard many times in my career. You think that has any chance of passing through Congress? No. The Marines are among the most popular causes in Congress ever. So when a distinguished USAID veteran correctly, it must be Janet, it's Putin calling me. You can come back. But notice the ingredients. You've got to have a president who wants USAID to do things. You've got to have a USAID director. In some cases, it's an economist. You've got to have a USAID director who can talk to the president personally about what we should do, sir or ma'am. Then you've got to have a team within your agency that gets it about strategy. Not everybody, not even necessarily 1% would have to know about what is our USAID strategy for the next 5 years. But then you've got to, and I wouldn't use the word sell to Congress, you've got to bring Congress along, but not the whole place. Only a few people care, or as I used to say, can even spell USAID. I went to a hearing one time. The best friend of USAID I ever saw was Pat Leahy. He chaired the Foreign Affairs Subcommittee that controlled the USAID budget. One time he was outsmarted by Jesse Helms. He shows up at a conference. There's a GAO, I think it was, might have been CRS too, a report. The largest number of condoms in the world was in a big USAID warehouse outside of Cairo. Well, why were so many condoms in this big warehouse? It's a newspaper story. It hurt the African Economic Reform Program. It hurt a lot of things. Clever enemy within Congress. Later, Jesse Helms was brought around to support a number of specific USAID programs. So it can be done. But notice the level of commitment it takes to do this. So your warning Congress is the enemy and Jim's caution, sometimes they're the enemy, is really the heart of what I'm trying to propose. Case studies, secret strategy being read by young officers. You couldn't put a Marine lieutenant out in the field just like that, but USAID seems to do this. The Marine lieutenant needs to lead his platoon, know how to fire back, know a lot of things from Quantico. There needs to be something like that also at mid-career training for USAID. Okay, you've had 10 years as an education officer, now come in and do this. So that's my advocacy in my yet-to-be-published study of secret successes in USAID.
I want to thank our esteemed panelists for these insights. I think there is a lot here, and I'm hoping that we can somehow capture kind of the themes of this conversation. I know there were many more questions, and so hopefully you have some time to hang around and chat. But with that, I just would ask you to give one more round of applause for our panelists.
And a special round of applause for Casey trying to manage these three. It's not an easy job. Thank you all three of you, and you can see why we need a real independent, objective history of USAID in order to be able to capture some of all this. And part of it is going to be a revisiting for your benefit of the basic human needs strategy as interpreted by the people who really know. So I don't want that to go without saying. Lunch is now served, and you go out here, and there are 2 lines, so you can get your food quickly, and there are tables back there. There are not enough chairs back there, so you can move it from the back through those doors, some of the chairs. If you want to sit down, there are some places where you can stand up. Those of you who are interested in the history, you might seek me out, and we can talk a little bit about that too. Anyway, thank you again for what you've been able to do. Oh yes, I'm sorry, we come back at 2 o'clock for sure, and we'll start assembling you before that.